Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Solutions webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Energy, Policy, and Climate program, the Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy program, and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on women and gender on the front lines of climate. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Sustainable Solutions playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Rachel Isaacs, Program Coordinator and Lecturer in the Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Women and Gender on the Front Lines of Climate panel. In this panel, we're going to look at and discuss the disproportionate impacts of climate change on women and girls, the ways in which women are often the main drivers toward climate action and change, and the many ways we can empower women and girls through education. It is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. I'll first introduce Lorena Aguilar, a global leader passionate about human rights, inclusion, and sustainable development, who has been providing strategic contributions to national and international policies for more than 3 decades. She leads inclusive collaborations with government counterparts, UN agencies, international organizations, and civil society towards advancing inclusive and equitable sustainable development. She has field experience in more than 50 countries across Latin America, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia, and has served as the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica. Currently, she is the Executive Director of the Kaschak Institute of Social Justice for Women and Girls at Binghamton University. Our second panelist is Christina Kwauk, a social scientist with an interdisciplinary focus on education and training for climate action. She is an expert on girls' education in developing country, 21st century skills and youth empowerment, and the intersection of gender, education, and climate change. She works as an education consultant and is co-founder and chief technical officer at Unbounded Associates. She also serves on the Cosmos of Stars for Redden Intel, Girls Rising's Advisory Council, the International Jury for the UNESCO Prize for Girls and Women's Education, and is a member of the Climate Change Action Plan Ad Hoc Committee for the Prince George's County Public School Board of Education. Formerly, she was a fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute and associate director of the Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate, Communication, and Education Project, and the head of the Climate and Education at the Education Commission. Our last panelist is Nevada Winrow, who is the founder and CEO of Black Girls Dive Foundation. This is a national nonprofit dedicated to empowering underrepresented youth in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics through marine and environmental sciences, scuba diving, and robotics. With a background as a neuroscientist and a former university professor, she has combined her academic expertise with her passion for ocean conservation to design transformative, research-based programs that foster STEM identity, leadership, and environmental stewardship. Under her leadership, Black Girls Dive Foundation has grown into a pioneering organization that partners with aquariums, universities, and research institutions to provide hands-on, experiential learning opportunities for girls of color across the United States. She is widely recognized for her innovative approaches to broadening participation in STEM, her commitment to equity in education, and her vision of creating pathways for the next generation of scientists, explorers, and change makers. It is my pleasure to introduce all three. We'll start with giving introductions and presentations. We will start with Lorena Aguilar.
Thank you very much, Rachel, first for the invitation and for the possibility of sharing this event with such an amazing group of women. So I'm going to talk a little bit. Oh, you can see it now? Yeah, okay, great. So definitely, when we talk about climate change, we all know that we are toward the edge of the cliff. This is the latest data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We are facing, for example, 2024 was the hottest year recorded since 1850, and we don't have still all the data for 2025 because it hasn't ended yet. Also, we're seeing sea level rise, and if we go past the 1 degree, which we already have, and getting toward 2 degrees, we're talking about an increase of 80 million people that are going to be affected by sea level rise. And disasters in the span of 1970 to 2024, there has been a dramatic increase, not only in the quantity, but also in the intensity. The average number of people exposed to flooding, for example, have increased by 114%. And a single hurricane can lead to a reduction in a country's annual GDP up to 800%. But how does this climate change finds the women and the girls of the world? Well, I mean, it finds us already facing what we call 5 structural knots of gender inequality, in which we don't have the same control and access of natural resources. We lack or have limited access to what are goods and services. We face patriarchal, discriminatory, and violent cultural patterns. Limited access to participation, and something that we don't talk a lot about, but is this sexual division of labor, what we call the organization of care. So just to give you an example of how this interacts, 143 economies, according to the World Bank, 90% have at least one law restricting economic equality for women. And only 4% of the chairs at the World Energy Council are women. And in only 44 countries, women have the same inheritance right as men. When it comes to disasters, this is a photo of Hurricane Mitch. And there are studies conducted. London School of Economics did some studies in which, for those countries in which these gender knots on inequality persist and exist, the ratio of death for every man, 4 women died. And let me give you just an example of Mitch, very fast. On the coast of Honduras, this woman, Doña Vera, was living in a slum house, a house made of chalkboard and zinc, when her neighbor comes and tells her that there is a hurricane coming with 220-kilometer winds. And her answer was how much it is. She had never been to school. She had never owned a car. I mean, she didn't know how much 220 kilometers were, what she had to do at that amount of wind that was coming. They have never been invited to any of the training on disaster risk reduction, and they confused information. I mean, when you're lost in the mountain, you usually walk down the river, and they start walking by the stadium. She had 3 kids, 2 holding in her hands, 1 tied by her chest, and then the waters that were coming down the mountain and up the stream just took away her 2 kids, and she was in a tree with the other kid for 3 days. She was picked, sent to a camp, and her words were, you know what happens to a single woman. She was raped while she was there. She returns to her house, nothing was left, and then an NGO came and said, don't worry, Doña Vera, we're going to rebuild your house. And they only asked her for one thing: the property, the rights for her land. And that's when she said, definitely, this hurricane had something more against women than it did against men. We don't talk, as I mentioned before, on care and how women or girls are really having an impact, both as caregivers, but also on their lives. And we have to talk more, and we can talk about more about the linkages between care and climate change, which is definitely a new topic. But we have had some advancement. The UNFCCC, that is the Climate Change Convention, due to this data. In the past decades, we have generated more information and more data. Today in the morning, we were in an expert meeting group for a report that UN Women is going to produce. Incredible amount of data had been produced. Unfortunately, when this convention was created, it was the only one that had no mention to women's rights and gender equality from the onset. Before 27, there was not a single reference to gender. Today, thanks to an organized group of parties, countries, and different social movements, today we have more than 130 gender mandates. And we have 2 gender action plans, and we are in the process of developing the 3rd gender action plan. Finance, something that we have a lot of discussions to do. For the first time, also, I mean, in addition to the mandates, we have worked with the financing mechanisms, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environmental Facility. All of them have mandates, either in the form of gender policies or action plans. However, and we can talk a lot about that more in our Q&A, this finance architecture has not been designed to have direct access. And the funds are mainly challenged, what they're called implementing agencies. So there is a lot to discuss on how can women and women organizations access these billions of dollars that are related to climate change. And definitely it's an opportunity to a more transformative recovery with equality and sustainability. Reporting of UNFCCC also has improved the percentage of parties referring to gender in the latest NDCs, not in the ones that we have in this section, has also been increasing. On July 2024, 90% of the 60 national adaptation plans refer to gender. And now on the new set of indicators that are being discussed under the Paris Agreement, there are some references to this. We have some definitely promising practices. We're not only vulnerable to climate change, we have all these activities that are incorporating what I call the right eyes for climate change. They're inclusive, they're improving the quality of life, but they're also looking at innovation. And I want to make this point. I mean, we cannot go with projects only linked to women with cook stoves, chicken, pigs, and backyards. We really, to impulse transformational change, we need to bring innovation into some of these initiatives and policies. And please give me just 2 of them. We have, for example, in urban setting, this initiative of 1 million women who are committed to cut over 100,000 tons of carbon. This is as we have taken 240,000 cars off of the road. And we have an app that shows in real time our collective impact when we all act together. And this initiative will also doing it now at Binghamton University, in which the students are also committing to cut emissions. We have this incredible initiative in Verona, Italy, that is recycling high quality fabric waste from fashion. 85% are women, 70% for disadvantaged women. And the data of what they're doing, they're saving 60 million kilowatts, 500,000 tons of water, 20,000 tons of textile recover and recycle. So there are literally thousands of projects of promising practices that are doing that. However, we still face a lot of challenges. At the moment, we see a setback on human rights and gender equality nationally and internationally. There's less ambition. Parties are challenging agreed texts within the international forums. There is this, let's say, struggle between reference to gender equality and gender responsiveness versus national determined circumstances. And there is no interest in advancing new topics such as GBV or care in this context. Some parties are interested in seeing the issue disappear. There is a lack of know-how at the national level. Okay, we have these 130 mandates, but I don't know how to do a project on energy transition and to be gender responsive. And there is a tremendous lack of accountability nationally and internationally. And we're putting out with UN Women and the Kaschak Institute a new scorecard precisely to bring more accountability on the different countries. And just to finish, I mean, we're 50% of the population. We're 3.5 billion solutions to climate change. And disregarding the potential of half of the world is not merely illogical, it's really utterly absurd. With women providing millions of diverse strategy for adapting to droughts, dismissing the wealth, for example, of capability will constitute a monumental oversight in our collective pursuit of addressing climate and land challenges, a misstep that the world and we cannot afford. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lorena. Next, we will hear from Christina Kwauk.
All right, thank you. Just as I was trying to transition my slides here, I hope you can see my screen all right. It's a delight to come right after Lorena. Wow, Lorena, your presentation was very powerful, and I think that there must have been a coincidence in terms of Rachel and our organizers placing us in the order that we're going, because I can already see a really nice arc in our presentations and our discussion that we can have later. I am going to now drill us a little bit into the education space and talk a little bit about not only the impacts, the disproportionate impacts that women and girls face when it comes to their educational opportunities in the context of climate change, but then also the powerful impact that investment in not only girls' education, but gender transformative education for climate action can have on our ability to navigate and transform from this current climate crisis. So I won't spend too much time on this particular slide because I think Lorena just framed it so beautifully for us already. Climate impacts are very clearly gendered. I think it's critical for us to remember and keep front and center in our minds that even though the climate change is incredibly gendered in terms of its impacts, we have to remember that the cause is incredibly inequitable as well. That it is driven by our unsustainable consumption of fossil fuel energy. These are the primary drivers, and it's primarily coming from high-income countries. It's coming from primarily wealthy individuals. And we have to remember that in the context of also remembering that women and girls in all their diversity are the ones who are being disproportionately impacted by the economic and health impacts of that climate crisis. When it comes to education, we have so much literature, so much data out there that shows us that not only are the impacts of climate change gendered themselves, but it impacts educational outcomes in very gendered ways. Girls in vulnerable households are more likely to be withdrawn from school in the context of protracted climate-related crises, as well as climate shocks that are experienced in vulnerable communities. And that oftentimes that means that girls are forced to begin transitioning into adulthood much earlier than they may be ready to, whether that means going into early and forced child marriage or experiencing unwanted pregnancy because of sexual assault, the likelihood of sexual assault and sexual and gender-based violence increases when girls are out of school. So this just sort of puts them in more heightened risk of early transitions to adulthood. We have great data that shows us also that when girls are withdrawn from school, gender norms, especially around practices that put them into more environmentally exposed to environmental hazards, means that they are also going to experience heightened risk of other forms of gender-based violence. But in terms of fetching, whether that means to go extra distances to fetch water in communities where drought impacts the ability to access clean drinking water for cooking, washing, and so on. As Lorena mentioned earlier, when girls and women are forced into temporary facilities, whether that's shelters, having to go and use any kind of temporary facility, whether that's for learning or not, also experience heightened rates of harassment and violence and so on. So these are clearly, the gendered impacts not only impact their health and their economic outcomes, but also their educational outcomes. But importantly, and the rest of my few minutes here will be focused on how we can really look at education as an important climate solution. I like to talk about this in terms of three different pathways. I'll spend most of my time talking about the first two. If we have time, I'll talk through the third one. But I wanted to get at really kind of how we can view this as a key investment when it comes to ensuring that girls and women are set on a pathway to climate resilience and adaptive capacity. And the first one is, the first pathway is thinking about this as universal education. And so this is where, every child receives 12 years of quality education. And why is that important? Not only for the sake of getting education, but because education is the strongest predictor of adaptive capacity. When we look at how that is the case, it largely boils down to two different pathways. One is a very direct pathway and one is an indirect pathway. And the direct pathway is that education facilitates cognitive development, skills, capacity, behavioral change, informed decision-making. These are things that we gain directly from opportunities to learn. Indirectly, education strengthens adaptive capacity by helping to reduce extreme poverty, improving health outcomes, enabling people to be better able to perceive and reduce their risks. Again, kind of thinking about the example that Lorena pointed out to the young woman who, was like, what does 210 kilometers per hour mean? You can just perceive that is a high risk situation and how you might need to respond to that, whether in preparation or, to reduce your exposure to that risk. It also provides the flexibility to learn new skills. So this is extremely important in the context of a rapidly changing economy, where whether that economy is impacted by climate change or not, the need to be able to be flexible, to find new jobs, find new livelihoods, diversify one's income, become less dependent on climate sensitive sectors. These are so critical in our current climate impacted economies, and more education allows greater flexibility with that ability to learn new skills and identify different livelihood opportunities. So you just get more agency in the face of crisis and open up options to respond and to adapt. From the perspective of gender here, I have a couple of stats here, that educated women are better equipped to adapt and protect themselves and their families. They're better able to proactively participate in disaster preparedness activities, and so on, right? So we know that just increasing girls and women, boys and men's opportunities to get 12 years of education is critical to enabling that. But we are a far cry from achieving universal education. The latest estimates suggest that 250 million children are not in school, and that most of these children are concentrated in low-income country contexts. We know that girls are especially exposed and vulnerable in those contexts. There's some really great statistics out there in terms of just the number of girls that are in extremely vulnerable climate contexts and what that means to their educational opportunities. We also have in learning poverty, global learning poverty that we're experiencing around the world that has been exacerbated by COVID. What is learning poverty? Learning poverty basically measures the share of children who cannot read a simple text by the age of 10, even though they may be in school. So they're in school and not necessarily learning. So we know, universal education can be such a powerful pathway to adaptive capacity and climate resilience, especially for women and girls. But we are we are faced by so many challenges just achieving universal education, and that, we need desperately to do something about that. The second route that education is a climate solution is this is sort of the bread and butter of this conversation and our three talks today is around girls' education. And again, thinking about this as girls and women in all of their diversity here. A key challenge, as I mentioned before, is the persisting gender inequalities, especially in low and middle income country contexts, that pose enormous challenges and barriers for girls to even get an education in many contexts. So this is what this particular pathway is referring to, those particular kinds of contexts. In thinking about that, the flip side of the gendered impacts on girls' education is that an investment in girls' education has been found to be a powerful determinant for adaptive capacity and resilience at the country level. So where countries have higher levels of female education, they also have their countries have higher indices on adaptive capacity. And it's just, the relationship is very, very clear that investment in girls' education is critical to wider adaptive capacity. So when we talk about girls' education as a climate solution, we can think about this in three different ways. So three distinct pathways that girls' education can be a climate solution. And the first one is that if girls have the opportunity to have their full education, and especially an education that also builds critical and comprehensive sexuality education and a rights-based approach to sexual reproductive health and rights in education, that increases girls' bodily autonomy and her agency over her reproductive life and her reproductive choices, and is critical to ensuring that she chooses when she starts a family, if she starts a family, and how many children she might want to have. And that control over her own life enhances her agency and her capacity to invest in whether that's skills, a livelihood, or opportunities on her terms. And that in itself is a critical piece for adaptive capacity and the ability to cope and respond in the context of climate change. The second pathway is thinking about how increased education for girls provides important leadership development opportunities. And I think our next speaker will really get into this, as well as the third pathway. But we have great data that shows us that when you have countries that have more women in leadership positions, politically appointed leadership positions, and more women in decision-making positions in their communities, they have lower carbon footprints. They have greater protected land areas and ocean areas. The data just speaks a ton in terms of we need more women in leadership and decision-making positions. And then the third pathway, when we think about girls' education, is the skills that this enables, and especially the breadth of green skills that are necessary for girls and women's participation in the green economy. And this is, again, is so incredibly important when we're thinking about how, as countries transition to low carbon development pathways, if girls and women are not having the opportunity to build that breadth of green skills, that green economy that we are going to be building will be built without her, right? Without her experiences, her needs, her worldview, her perspective, her innovations in mind, right? And then maybe I only have time for maybe one more slide. But we have challenges, right? We have three powerful reasons to invest in girls' education as a climate solution, but the education of millions of girls is at risk of disruption due to climate events. And these pathways of disruption are both direct and indirect. Direct, it comes through the direct destruction that schools experience around the world, and especially in climate vulnerable places, where the degradation of the learning environments, the destruction of WASH infrastructure that are critical to ensuring girls and women in these contexts go to school during menstruation, for example. Like, these things are direct ways of ensuring girls do not go to school. And then the indirect effects being the loss of livelihoods that their families may experience, which then, especially in contexts where boys' education is prioritized, girls are, as a coping response for their households, girls are pulled out of school, and, as I mentioned before, transition to early adulthood, or transition to adulthood much earlier than they want or should be. So we have, just as a sense of, education not only gets impacted in gendered ways, but an investment in education through a gender transformative lens is so vital for thinking about how we reduce those vulnerabilities that girls and women face, but importantly, how we address the climate crisis as humanity. So I will stop there. If you're curious, the third pathway is climate education, but I won't get into that now because I think I've passed my time. So thank you so much, and over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Christina. And we can always talk more about climate and education when we get to the Q&A portion of the program for sure. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Nevada Winrow.
All right, so I'm not going to go through all. So this, I guess my presentation comes on the back end of actually putting theory to practice and creating a program for young ladies where they can have the direct experience of how the climate is impacting them through education. One of the key things in getting people to understand what's going on is if they're directly in the midst of it. And I believe that's what our program, our STREAMS program, contributes to the informal science learning space, is providing young ladies the opportunity to experience what's going on with our climate. One of the key things in developing our program, where we were looking at barriers, so what we call either historically excluded or historically underrepresented. So historically excluded, historically African Americans weren't provided access to pools or to beaches. They were denied access to a quality education, which led to being historically underrepresented later on down the line. So, aquatic-based recreational activities, the lack of representation in undergrad and STEM, and just limited representation in the workforce. So what our STREAMS program does is provide young girls the opportunity to share space and time with subject matter experts and learning about their environment. Now, for some reason, let me see if my little video will work here.
Dr. Nevada Winrow is making a big splash and going into the deep end where young girls from underserved communities don't typically swim.
The biggest thing that we hear is, I don't want to get my hair wet. And it's like, that's not a good reason to drown because you didn't want to get your hair wet. You need to learn how to swim.
The numbers show it. The Centers for Disease Control says African American children ages 5 to 14 are almost 3 times as likely to die from drowning compared to white children. Air is in their tank. Their hair is wet. It's a new breath of life for these young scuba divers.
Sometimes you have to step out of your comfort zone until you really don't feel like it.
We're all nerds. We're all scientists. So it's like, have an opportunity, just to, be nerdy and feel comfortable about it.
Black Girls Dive is combining swimming lessons with a STEM education, diving deeper into science and math. The foundation started just 2 years ago in Baltimore County.
My daughter and I got to thinking, like, how can we integrate that with the gap with STEM and minorities? So I said, well, you still need to understand the way the body responds in water. So, that's the physics, the physiology.
They took those lessons on the road last month, their first capstone trip to Andros Island in the Bahamas. Girls as young as 11 are now certified in scuba diving.
It was fun. It was scary on the deep dives, but otherwise it was a fun experience.
A cultural experience and a cleanup of the local beaches and water.
We picked up a lot of gasoline bottles. We picked up a lot of alcohol bottles.
And they found new courage in themselves and perhaps a career.
Once you actually learn how to have a healthy respect and fear for the water, then you become better scuba divers.
It helps us get a better understanding of science and things that you wouldn't even think of doing at ages like elementary school. Like they're working on Photoshop, which is on there, and engineering and actual diving.
It's working. It's adding a little bit green.
They're getting dry lessons at the computer on color correction of their underwater photos.
And it's a whole new world.
Wet hair isn't stopping this group from diving into new life lessons. For Chesapeake Bay Magazine's Bay Bulletin, I'm Cheryl Costello.
So that's just a little clip that I like to show to kind of to give the audience an idea of some of the experiences for our young ladies. Uh, from a theoretical standpoint, we look at I call it the CPR method, where there's competence, where they're learning about subject matter. Then there's their performance, where they're given the opportunity to perform. And then also the R, the recognition, that they're being recognized by other people in the field to make them, so they don't get that what I call imposter syndrome. So they're having opportunity to work with other subject matter experts to make them feel like to develop their sense of belongingness and what I call their STEM identity. Um, One of the biggest barriers that we work on is just the mismatch of mentorship and the economic barriers. You know, scuba diving is expensive. So we, through grant writing and fundraising, we try to remove those barriers so they have an opportunity to learn about the ocean without, it being cost prohibitive, so to speak. And I'm trying to figure out a way to make this. Okay, so this is basically the structure of our program. So we have scuba and scientific diving. So with the scuba, they're getting their basic training. Then they go through their specialty training, such as full face mask. They do dry suit. Then, of course, their scientific diving, where they're learning about research methodology, data tools. And at the end of each year, they do what's called a capstone. So everything they learn in that year is put together for a major project. So for instance, their first year, they go to Forfar field station, or they go to the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Science. They do their checkout dives, they're doing their ocean and beach cleanups. They're looking at water chemistry, looking at the effects of the ozone and all that goes into, for instance, microplastics. They're in the lab looking at the impact on the ecosystem of like microplastics and so forth. So they're really getting a firsthand experience. Then they also have their remote operated vehicle training. So they are learning about ROVs, design and fabrication. They're doing piloting and in-field piloting. One of our favorite core components is the shark research and conservation. So here they're doing shark tagging. They're pulling the sharks up onto the boat. They are tagging their dorsal fin with a satellite tag. They're learning ArcGIS. So they're being able to track their migrational pattern. So it gets into physics, their math. So there's a redundancy in their learning. So they're seeing how certain things are applied. They also do aerial drones, and then of course our aquarium dive programming, where they're learning how the aquarium is part of conservation and what it takes to take care of animals, what it takes to run an aquarium. So they're getting all that information from subject matter experts. And then we have a behind the lens component, where they're doing their underwater photogrammetry, their underwater photography, and storytelling is a big thing. Learning how to tell and share their stories is a major component for us, and they absolutely love that, because they love to tell stories, share their stories. And again, our capstones are our big projects. Um, and they get more advanced as time goes on. We follow our students. We take them as young as 9, and we follow them up and through college for metric purposes. So we know of all the young ladies that came through our program, how many went to college. Like we have a 100% college acceptance rate. How many of them majored in STEM? How many of them received a degree in STEM? And how many are going into a grad program, or they're going into the workforce? So we're keeping track of those metrics. I'm trying to think, what else can I share? Other capstones, the Egyptian capstone is a big capstone for us. They spent a year learning Arabic. and learning about the culture before we head over to Egypt. And they spend several days in Sharm el-Sheikh where they do some diving, and then they spend the latter part of the program in Cairo. So they're, visiting the pyramids and just learning about the culture, visiting mosques, and so forth. So our program has been around since 2017, and we just had our first college graduate last year. This year, we have 3 more young ladies who are graduating. They're all in STEM. We have a young lady that went to the Savannah College of Art and Design who's doing underwater animation. So it's adjacent. It's kind of STEM adjacent. But they all get into their first choice schools, and they're actually doing well.
Thank you so much. All of these presentations were absolutely wonderful. Everybody, I wrote it in the chat, but so I'll say it out loud as well, is we're now in the question and answer portion of the program. So I know there's some questions already, but if anybody has any questions for everybody or anybody in particular, please put those questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. And I will start it off with one of the public questions from Amber Lively. Regarding universal education, there are often assumed and actual cultural sentiments regarding the importance of access to education in rural areas of developing nations. Is there an integration plan or a template for advocates in these communities to use as a tool for implementation? And that is a question for everybody. Not an easy question.
Let's revisit that question one more time.
Okay, so regarding universal education,
Okay.
There are assumed and actual cultural sentiments regarding the importance of access to education in rural areas. Is there an integration plan or a template for advocates? So people going to visit and trying to help with education, educating in these rural areas in developing nations. Is there some sort of plan or template that those advocates can use to help implement these ideas of, of universal education?
From my experience, yes. I know, for instance, Nautilus has a professional development module and pedagogical tools where teachers can download assignments and teach things in a rural area. There are a couple organizations that provide pedagogical tools that allow teachers to utilize those resources. Honestly, in K through 12, there's not a lot of money, a lot of funding in marine sciences. So when you have things like Nautilus and I think OSERCH and a couple other places that provide tools, I think it's very, very helpful because they just don't have the funding or the bandwidth a lot of times in public school systems. So there are resources out there.
Christina or Lorena?
Yes, can you see me? Yes. There are 50 countries worldwide that have developed what are called climate change gender action plans. And within those, education has always been a central element of these climate change gender action plans. And I'm talking about mainly developing countries that have developed these CCGAPs that are called. Now, when it comes to the funding of these type of initiatives, there are important funds, but especially educators and women organizations and organizations that are working on the linkages between gender and climate change know very little on how to access these resources. And a lot of them are being done at national level in which their voices and they are not represented at all. So I think that is instrumental to look at these political will and how it's being developed into these programs and plans at the national level. But then the next step, as was being said, is where are the resources and the how to do it. And this example was just amazing, precisely on how to do it and overcome some of those cultural and barriers.
Thank you. I guess maybe to just add a little bit onto this, while both Nevada and Lorena pointed out, the critical importance of leveraging existing tools and frameworks that may be out there, or action plans that have been developed via consensus through processes like the UNFCCC processes. Although consensus, who's at the table, right? There's another question about that one, but one thing that I would caution against sort of a blanket universal approach is that, climate impacts places and communities in such hyper local ways that it's also critical to bear in mind that, if advocates in a community or visiting a community come with sort of these broader plans, that there's also critical attention to what are the local contextual needs and experiences, so that there are no cookie cutter approaches applied universally, but that there's an opportunity to co-create and co-develop with community members. So I think when I saw the universal education part of that, I wasn't sure which direction of universality was intended in the question. So I just wanted to make sure that point was made. Thank you.
Thank you. A question from Lama El Hato. With climate impacting women and children the most, how do we manage the risks of gender-based violence that can ensue, as was seen with the increase in rape and teen pregnancies in Brazil's shelters last year in 2024 during the devastating floods?
That's a loaded question. That's dealing with some other stuff, though.
Well, the problem with the GBV is that is not very well understood when it comes to climate change and its relation. And this is an area, for example, that we're trying to really, really put it on top of the discussions, both internationally and nationally. And there is a rejection from a lot of parties, countries, to make the linkage and to really understand where it stands. I mean, we heard about some of these perversive adaptation mechanisms, like marrying girls at a very, very early age, because it's a perversive adaptation mechanism because the communities don't have any other resource and they can sell them for $20, $50 to survive for a month. So what we're seeing is that GBV is exacerbated as an adapting, coping, perversive mechanism in a lot of countries. But still, when you look, for example, at the national determined contribution documents, these are the strategies that the countries are developing to address climate change. A very, 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 very small fraction are acknowledging those linkages. So I think that there is a need to really work on this. We know the data is there, but still the countries do not want to address GBV, climate change, and the triple environmental crisis, like loss of biodiversity and drylands and degradation of lands. But there is definitely a link to it.
Yeah, and I think raising that awareness around the interlinkage between environmental sort of extraction and gender-based violence is so critical, so that as we as a community are trying to address environmental challenges, impacts, that we are also critically thinking about how those are intertwined with gender-based violence and vice versa. Like just the
Yeah. And we have another sector that we have not talked about, but are the human rights environmental defenders, in which a lot of them are women worldwide. And we see how violence is exercised in a different way. for these environmental defenders. Like Latin America, the region that I come from, is the most risky area in the world to be an environmental human rights defender. And these women are subject to a completely different type of violence. I mean, they are raped, their husbands are being asked to exercise violence to them so that they stop doing it. Violence is exercised on their kids. So there's so many different ways that this is being portrayed, and the data is just starting to come. And for groups like the environmental defenders is very difficult because they need to be anonymous. They need to remain in anonymity because you really face challenges that manned defenders do face them, but not at the level in which this combines with GBV, for example.
Question from Gladys Bustos. Thank you, everybody. What do you do in regions that don't have schools? Is there funding or scholarships? How do we sponsor specific regions? I'm speaking from her. I am Latina and bilingual.
Education doesn't need to be only formal. It can be informal. And there is a lot of ways to work with these communities in which what we understand like a standardized schooling system is available. I mean, there are many other ways to educate, especially girls, when it comes to this area of work, but you just need to find a way. The limitation of that is not the problem. That's your reality. That's what you're working with. People said like, oh, that is the problem. No. I mean, that's your reality. That's different. So that's what you need to provide are solutions that are tailor-made, that are cultural relevant, that understands. I mean, the Nevada example is great because it addresses some of those cultural build-ups that we have, the different groups have around it. So you just need to find a way to do it. And don't say like, oh, because there's no educational system provided, there's no way. No, there is a way of doing it.
Cassie Hansen, how can attendees help support all three important causes? So all of these people, what can they do? Action items.
Volunteer your time and talent to organizations.
I have to say also, learn about the climate ecosystem in your country or your community or your region. Get informed, make sure that you get in the table. Otherwise, you're going to be part of the menu if you are not in the table. You need to really, really understand that ecosystem, demand to be part. And from there, you can just move forward, developing projects and initiatives that can really have an impact on your needs, on the needs of that you represent in those communities. But unless you understand very well how these policies are being developed, how money is being diverted, who is getting access to education, who is getting access to the goods and services, you don't stand a chance to be part of those that makes the solutions.
Yeah, and if you happen to be a student out there, I know that there's some students who are in attendance, no matter what field you are studying, climate change will impact your sector. And so, if you can find ways to connect your studies or your research to climate change and integrate a gender lens in that work, that even though, like Lorena will point, so much data is coming, it's coming, right? We need more of it. And if you can dedicate your studies to helping generate more data so that we can better understand the intersections of gender and climate in multiple sectors, the better we are to be able to diagnose problems and to identify solutions. So in addition to volunteering and learning about your context, I think if you are a student out there, how can you leverage your studies to identify these challenges and to address gender and climate through your work?
And I know one of the biggest issues, and you all have mentioned it, every single one of you, is funding. With with adequate funding, education can happen. And we focused on developing countries, but in the US, one of the wealthiest nations in the world, many do have access to education, but the US is one of the biggest polluters in the world. How do you all envision coming over these wealth disparity obstacles, basically, and power obstacles, where the few seem to outweigh the many in terms of addressing climate action?
I'm talking too much, but here I go. It's part of my empowerment. One of the things that we're doing that I talked before is about living our beliefs. So, for example, have you checked your carbon footprint? Have you, I mean, there's things that you can do on your daily life to be coherent to what you're talking about. So it also talks about how you live your life. How can you reduce your carbon footprint? We have this program that is called I'm Ready, in which each one of the students is committing to reduce at least 1 ton of CO2 every year, because they are having these actions. But there are different ways, Rachel, that do not require thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, that you can really have an impact on climate change. And I ask your students, have you, because they're not only from the US, from what I see in the chat, do you know who are the financing mechanisms in your country? Do you know who is the gender focal point for the Green Environmental Fund and to the Global Environmental Facility? Do you know which projects are being developed? Do you have a way to get into them? Unless you understand how resources for climate change are floating, it's a little bit different for the US, but at the other countries especially, you have no chance of getting access to those resources if you don't understand that financial ecosystem in each one of your countries and be part of that.
Yeah, and maybe just like to plug one more thing in. I do have to run in a moment, but in the U.S. context, even though we have education and good in some contexts, good education, we are abysmal when it comes to climate education.
Oh, yes.
And the amount of influence that the petrol companies, we even have like a term of petropedagogies in our classrooms, where fossil fuel industries have infiltrated our education system and provide teachers who are in desperate need of resources, and equipment and materials with that equipment and materials, but it's all oriented towards the continued use of plastics or the, continued use of fossil fuels. So in the US, we may have education, but we have to think about the kind of education that we have around us, right? And so it's just as important, but it's a different kind of series of realities. As Lorena said, it's not a problem, but it's a reality, and we have to be able to respond to that. So I just wanted to say that before I have to jump.
Thank you so much, Christina. We'll have a couple of more questions and before we come to an end. And I think, 2 of these I think are fairly related, but specifically for Dr. Winrow, what is the criteria for the girls' acceptance into your program, or is there a cap on how many girls can join?
For safety reasons, we generally do not take more than 10 girls per cohort. There is an application process. It requires an interview, recommendations from the math and science teacher. There are some exclusionary criteria, for instance, medical problems, because you can't dive if you have, like, for instance, epilepsy or things like that. So there's certain things that will automatically exclude you, but we take a very deep dive into getting to know the prospective applicant. We're looking at their grades and their potential.
And one last question, since it relates, but are the girls selected to participate in climate change events based on their community involvement, or are they selected through an application method? And I think that was for anybody.
Well, for us, we're one of the requirements to continue in our program is community involvement. So it goes hand in hand. So while they may not have been as actively engaged before they became a BGD scholar, they are certainly engaged once they become a scholar in the community. So it is a requirement.
And with that, I want to thank all of the attendees who stuck around a little bit over time. And particularly, I want to thank the panelists. I know Christina had to run, but I want to thank Lorena and Nevada as well for this amazing discussion. Very powerful presentations. We very much appreciate your time. Thank you.